This video is brought to you by Nebula. Over the last few months, there's been a lot of media speculation about Ukraine's coming counteroffensive. Some analysts are anticipating something akin to what we saw in Kherson and Kharkiv last year, with the Ukrainians recapturing swathes of Russian-occupied territory, while other analysts are apparently less optimistic, warning that Kharkiv-esque advances are unlikely now that the Russians have had time to set up fortifications along the front lines. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at the three places Ukraine might stage its coming counteroffensive, and how far Ukraine would have to go in each theatre for it to count as a success. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So the way we're going to structure this video is, first we're going to try and define what would count as a successful offensive, and then we're going to look at three places where we think Ukraine might stage an offensive: Donbas, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, and how far Ukraine would have to go on each front to achieve success, as earlier defined. So let's start by defining what counts as a success. As we see it, there are basically two criteria for Ukraine's advance to be considered a success. First, the counteroffensive needs to achieve a significant strategic gain for Ukraine, and second, it needs to do enough to convince the West to continue to supply weapons. Obviously, these two criteria are linked, in that the West will be more likely to send weapons if it can see Ukraine making significant advances, because A, it knows that its weapons are working, and B, Ukraine will be more likely to make further gains, but they do diverge at points. Just to take a limit case, if Ukraine was to advance straight from Kherson all the way into Crimea, then the West might actually reduce its support, because, well, Ukraine wouldn't need any further help, but also because certain Western politicians have indicated that they won't support Ukraine in retaking Crimea to reduce the risk of nuclear escalation. Anyway, that being said, let's start with Donbas. Obviously, if Ukraine decides to stage its counteroffensive in Donbas, there are quite a few options. They could try to retake the bulk of Bakhmut, or they could push back into the suburbs around Donetsk city, in places like Marinka and Avdiivka. However, as we see it, the most likely move here is an advance in the north of Donbas, towards the towns of Svatove and Kreminna, two towns with a pre-war population of about 15,000. This is because Bakhmut has been bombed to rubble, which limits its strategic value and makes retaking it difficult. And because the Donetsk suburbs have been the de facto frontline since 2014, which means pro-Russian and Russian forces have had a while to build up fortifications, which makes significant gains similarly difficult. While the Russians have recently redeployed significant troops around Svatove and Kreminna, they don't enjoy the same structural defences as, say, Avdiivka, and the Ukrainians have been prodding Russian defence lines in the region for months now. So, what would constitute a success here? Well, if the Ukrainians were able to take either town, this would probably count as a success. It would represent a significant strategic gain. While the towns themselves are small, they lie on the P66 highway and are of strategic importance because they're used to transport supplies from Belgorod and other supply depots in western Russia down to Russian troops in places like Rubizhne, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. It might not look all that dramatic on a map, so it might not spark as much excitement as, say, the Kharkiv counteroffensive, but it'll probably be enough to keep Western arms flowing in. The second place on our list is Zaporizhzhia, where Ukraine might try to advance south from Zaporizhzhia city down to Melitopol. Now, when commentators talk about a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporizhzhia, they often seem to tacitly assume that Ukraine would have to reach Melitopol for the offensive to count as a success. As we see it, this is too high a bar. Even an advance to, say, Tokmak, which is just 35 kilometers away from Ukrainian-controlled Orikhiv, would probably count as a success, by our criteria. It would be strategically significant, because it would put a serious strain on Russia's logistics operation in the south. At the moment, Russian troops in Melitopol and Kherson are supplied via a rail line, which runs from Russian-occupied territory in the east through to Tokmak down to Melitopol and then Crimea. If Ukraine were to capture Tokmak, then Russia could still supply its troops via roads running along the coast or from Crimea. But this wouldn't be ideal from a Russian perspective, especially given the Russian army's outsized reliance on rail networks. An advance to Tokmak would also probably be enough to convince the West to continue supplying weapons. Not only would it demonstrate that Western support is making a difference, but Western military planners might conclude that, if the West can support Ukraine until Melitopol, which would represent an enormous strategic gain, this might well force the Kremlin into peace talks. The third place on our list is Kherson. Here, the best case scenario for Ukraine, leaving aside the risk of asymmetric escalation by the Kremlin, would be an advance straight from Kherson down to Crimea, which could presage a siege of the peninsula. However, this is a tall order. Russia has a lot of fortifications in this area, and it would require crossing the Dnipro River, which is currently the de facto conflict line in the Kherson Oblast. As we see it, even just successfully crossing the Dnipro would count as a success here. If Ukraine could establish a permanent presence on the left bank of the river, perhaps by occupying one of the coastal towns and establish reliable supply lines here, this would represent a significant strategic gain. Not only would it make further advances in Kherson more likely, but it would also force the Russians to shift troops away from the east, where the bulk of Russian troops are currently deployed. Similarly, it would probably be enough to convince the West to continue sending weapons, both because a successful crossing will demonstrate the Ukrainians can make further crossings, but also because an abrupt pause in Western support would make Ukrainian troops on the left bank of the Dnipro dangerously vulnerable. So those are what we see as the three options. If you made it this far, you'll definitely enjoy the Modern Conflict series. That's a show made by our friends over at Real Life Law, where they break down recent conflicts from around the world, including the Ethiopian civil war and the war in Ukraine, which we've discussed a bunch before in TLDR's videos, as well as things like the US's invasion of Afghanistan and the Turkey-Greek Cold War. It's an incredible series, and it's only available on our streaming service, Nebula. You'll find a bunch of TLDR stuff on Nebula too. Every weekday we post an extended version of our show, The Daily Briefing, exclusively on Nebula, giving you bonus discussions and explainers. On Sundays, we release our show This Week in Parliament, which summarises the week's goings-on in Westminster, only on Nebula. Throughout the week, we released videos earlier on Nebula than on YouTube. Every video on Nebula is ad-free, which means that this isn't even here. And most importantly, signing up to Nebula is the best way to support TLDR and all the creators building the platform. It's also super cheap, just a couple of pounds a month. So if you want all of that incredible stuff, then please do sign up using the link in the description.